In this part of the lesson, we are going to analyze several important architects which are fundamental in the discussion about the structuralist architecture. In the previous part, we analyzed some general concept of the structuralism and why many architects and also philosophers and also writer and even artist intend to investigate the structures in nature and how structures can generate works, include architecture. The authors that we are going to analyze are Ellison and Peter Smithson, key people with the key works in this area, Moses Safdie, Hermann Herzberger, probably the most important personality in this area, and then finally Giancarlo De Carlo from Italy. One important remarks, several works of those authors can be classified at the same time as a structuralist and a brutalist. I please you to don't confuse the two terms. They are two completely different trends. There are architects who produce architecture work in the brutalism language, and there are authors which are only structuralists. Sometimes they create works which contain both of the trend. First, a little bit clarification. We have seen that the structuralist architecture intend to analyze structures, intend to analyze the framework, a large framework of the social aggregation in order to create architecture who could have a better answer for the needs of the human people. With the terms brutalism, we intend a sort of language. Brutalism came from one famous sentence of Le Corbusier, because when he discussed about concrete, which in France is béton brut, he intended to propose one architecture which was with a very strong texture, like the concrete show. So the brutalism is a kind of architecture which intend to show the quality of the material, the beautiful pattern of the natural concrete without any decoration, without any plaster, without any form of ornament. So the concrete was so expressive of his nature that become beautiful in itself, become evocative in terms of honesty and structures. For example, Ellison and Peter Smithson, but also Safdie, definitely Giancarlo De Carlo, and also Kenzo Tang, a giant in the modernist architecture. All of them can be considered brutalist, but at the same time, deeply rooted in their process of work are the structuralist method. So, in order to don't confuse, it may be case where brutalist architecture and the structuralist architecture can become a unity. The work express both of this trend, but this is not necessary. What it is very important to remark is the béton brut, the brutalist architecture. It is a language. It is what we can see, the appearance of the architecture of the building. The structuralist method is always invisible. It is hidden, exactly because the structures should not appear evident in the design. Let's start with the first author, extremely important in terms of history of modern architecture. This is Ellison and Peter Smithson. They were a couple, husband and wife, and their work is very important because every single building that they design and create was generated starting from structures. This is very important. We are going to quote two main projects of the Smithsons: the Golden Lane plan made in 1952 on the ruins of London, and the Robin Hood Gardens, which is still existing. Now, discussing about the Golden Lane project made in 1952, we have to express that those kind of work are very expressive of the process of structuralism. All the Golden Lane project was based on categories, such like home, street, district, or city. Those categories was definitely a program well defined in theory, but once applied in practice, they become once again abstract. They are not so concrete, they are kind of theoretical. Architecture, it is always have to be based on practice. It's a practical work. But those kind of superstructures, they fly too high, they are too general. The category of home can be clearly identified in the family unit. The street is a system of galleries that access the different parts of the building. They are placed on one side of the building and suspended. This kind of road, as we can see, they are definitely came by the elaboration of Le Corbusier, but in the unité d'habitation, the road, the corridor are inside, in the core of the building, but in this case become balcony. The idea of district and city was considered as a variable issue out of the limit of physical definition. So, if we have to analyze the work of the Smithson in the Golden Lane plan, we have to notice a very important element. First of all, the plan was huge. If we check the map of the building, we can say that the dimension of this plan, it's really out of scale. It is at the same time building, but also urban planning. And this is typical of the structuralist architecture, and in the future also to the macrostructures architecture. One of the weaknesses, we can say, of this project, a very important project, very interesting, very solid in terms of theory, but also weak in terms of practical realization. One of the problems we are going to say is this building never solved the problem of the connection between urban planning and building. The building scale has his own problem, properties, characteristics, and method. The urban planning is something completely different. The Smithson in this project, they never pass the contradiction in between the two scales. At the same time, the building is a building, a very long and articulated wall, as you can see in the picture, but the scale was too large. So it is a lack of details in terms of relationship in between building and city. If you can see in this picture, the city is non-existent. The wall is simply articulated on a white board. There are definitely some existing building that you can see from the sketch, but there is no connection with the texture of the city. The project is too general, and this is a typical problem of every macrostructures, and this one can be considered one of the prototype of the macrostructures architecture. So this is very important to notice. The Golden Lane project is a macrostructures which is spread over all the city, lack of connection with the ground, but definitely extremely interesting in terms of process, because we repeat again, all this project was based on categories. So the project worked very well, actually. It is quite remarkable. And in the following years, the Smithsons create a real building, which is called Robin Hood Gardens. The Robin Hood Garden have exactly the same, we can say, advantage and the disadvantage of the structuralist architecture. It is definitely very rational, very logic, for sure extremely cheap in the construction, and this is a key point in this form of architecture, because we have to remember that the structuralist architecture was created and was elaborated in the first years, the first decade of the post-war period. So all Europe have to be rebuilt, and for this reason, one of the necessity is modularity, quickness, and cheap in terms of construction cost. This building is not good looking anymore. It doesn't touch the taste of the contemporary people. It looks ugly, old, with a low quality of construction, and so on. But at that time was extremely advanced. So one point that we have to remark is, when you study architecture, never compare the quality of that architecture built in the past with our own standard, because the two worlds are simply uncomparable. There are no connection between us and their process of work and their life. This building answers precisely to a very specific problem: build a new form of architecture suitable for that society based on structures, because again, structuralism is one of the key words of that period. We find typical element in the Le Corbusier work, for example. So the city become compact inside one building, like in the Unité d'habitation that we have seen in the first lesson. We can see the distribution, the system of road, which are concentrated again in one building. If in the city we have a road, primary road, secondary road, local road, and so on, in this case all the roads are concentrated inside one building. If you see those kind of cut in the building, expressed in this picture, we can see that there are some corridor. Those are the road which connect the main staircase to the different apartments. So every single apartment can be considered one villa, one residential unit. So these kind of building could be easily considered one city in a form of a superblock. Superblock, it is a very important word in this phase of the history of architecture, because it is a typical approach of many architects which intend to recreate the city using massive blocks, which in itself can be considered as a district. Another very important project, and probably one of the most interesting and also funny building in this age, it is the Habitat 67. Habitat 67 was made by a very young, talented architect named Moses Safdie. Frankly speaking, according with my own personal opinion, it is not beautiful, but it is a wonderful project. If we are discussing this building only in terms of how beautiful it appears, well, I have a different taste. I like other building, but this is extremely interesting work. Moses Safdie, as well as the Smithson, intend to create a compact city in a form of a building. But this is a very special building. First of all, it is created by a very, very, very simple unit, which is the apartment itself, using a very strict and very rigid modularity. But the variation of this module, it is simply endless. What does it mean? You can consider all these projects made by only one or maybe two type unit. This type unit is always the same, identical, and then simply repeat as much as we want. But on the contrary of the architecture of the superstructures and the Smithson and many other cases that we cannot analyze in this class, generally speaking, the superstructures are always very boring. For example, even the Unité d'habitation of Le Corbusier, it is only a very simple wall, a building wall, where the single residential unit, the single apartment are identical or mostly identical in between each other. In this case, the situation is a little bit different, because the unit itself, it is basically similar, identical. But the system of aggregation, it is extremely flexible. If you study the details of this building, it appears like a cubic proliferation of unit. Every unit, it is identical. What it changes is the cut of the window. There are some variation, not much, but there are variation. But what makes this building simply amazing is the way how the blocks are combined together. Artistically, it seems like a cubist composition made by Picasso or Leger or other great painter from the avant-garde at the beginning of 20th century. In terms of architecture, it looks like a mountain, it looks like a kind of Lego construction, the popular game for child. But what it is very interesting and very remarkable in this project, it is not only the architectural features, which is very attractive in terms of architecture history. But what it is also very important, it is the social contents. People who lived in this Habitat 67 in their childhood, they expressed the joy of living in those kind of amazing, strange, unconventional places. The different units are separating between each other, but there are plenty of terrace, corridor, balcony, bridge, which connect every single unit with anything else. Somehow what we can see is that the interest of this Habitat 67 project, it is not only the architectural features, but the social features. This building is extremely successful because it builds a very strong identity for the whole community. The community is represented inside the architecture. There is no sense of segregation, no loneliness, but all the people act as the whole community. This is one of the most important aspects of this project, and this is why it is considered a masterpiece of architecture in the history of 20th century. To discuss about the third author, Hermann Herzberger, but in that case it is much more complicated because the office that the project that we intend to analyze, it is one office building made in Holland. The name is the Centraal Beheergebouw. Sorry for my pronunciation. My Dutch language is simply non-existent. What it is interesting in this project, it is the sense of modularity, which came from, is very similar to the idea of Musée Safdie. If we check the picture of the whole complex, it seems a nightmare because it is based on a square block repeated many times. And this one is it seems like an alienated project. It seems horrible. But on the contrary, the space inside is simply amazing. The project, as we can see from the plan, it is based on square block. Every square block is almost identical. It is a cell which is repeated many times. And this is typical of the structuralist architecture. The structuralist architecture intended to investigate very deeply, very obsessively, the logic, the use, the function of a single cell, a single unit. This single unit have to be at the same time perfect in itself, but have to be flexible enough to be one element of an endless possible aggregation of the same unit. And this project is very clear on that. If you check the picture, it looks all the same. What it changed a little bit is the variation of the height, but that is just a detail. And especially, this building can be as big as we want. So this office building, we can say, it is just a small detail of a building which can grow around all the world without any limitation. It's a nightmare? Well, yes, it is. But it is a typical process of the structuralist architecture. Inside the space are based on the block itself is still recognizable. For example, those angles are that you can see in the picture are the corner of the single block, and they are associated with the other block. In between, there is a buffer zone, which is the space connection in between different parts. Now, the description, the details of this project is very complicated. What it is important to notice is that every part of the building may have different use. So, the same form, the same system of aggregation, at the same time include a very flexible use of the space. Sometimes the corners are used for office or for relaxation, or other part can be considered cafeteria or a resting area or small indoor garden. Anyway, the function is not really important, but what it is important is that the flexibility of the space. This is quite interesting in the structuralist architecture, because the system of the single unit was so detailed, so well studied, that the function inside could be extremely flexible. So the structuralist architecture at the same time is very rigid in terms of aggregation, in terms of form of the unit itself, in terms of modularity, but the functions are always extremely flexible. This is one of the most successful buildings of Hermann Herzberger, and frankly speaking, one of the masterpieces in architecture, both for the quality of the space and for the logic behind the space. Another architect that we want to quote briefly, it is Giancarlo De Carlo, one of the great masters in Italy during the 20th century. Giancarlo De Carlo built several great buildings, something like Villaggio Matteotti in 1969, 1974, and also the one branch of the University of Urbino named the Tridente College of Urbino. In both of these cases, this is very evident, for example, in the Tridente College, the building, it is again based on modularity. If you check the form and the logic of the building are very, very similar, are basically identical, but the composition generate wonderful space. Urbino, it is one of the most beautiful places in Italy in terms of landscape. This building appear like a stairs, and this is a very good example of design, because the roof of the single block can be used as a terrace. But from the top, the view is really very nice. It's very beautiful. The building disappears. From the picture, it seems very massive and even offending the landscape. But the sense of the space in this building is quite interesting. Even more important in the production of Giancarlo De Carlo is Villaggio Matteotti. Villaggio Matteotti, it is one of the most successful cases in Italy for the social participation. What does it mean, a social participation in architecture? Generally talking, the architect acts as a superstar, as a god, who, with his talented design, imposes to the client his own will. So in this case, the architect have only to buy the products and shut up, because superstar command. But on the contrary, Giancarlo De Carlo was one of the most remarkable personality in what it is called bottom-up approach. Other words can be described as a social participation architecture. What does it mean? It means that the architect is simply an expert, a designer, who have to follow the will, the intention, the desire, the needs of the client. Because this one, it is a large unit, a residential unit, the process of design of this building is extremely complicated, because the architect have to work beside the client, work beside the people who in the future are going to live in this place. Sometimes this social participation approach is very difficult, because many cases of those residential buildings, the people who are going to live it belongs to a middle low class. And the needs are very different. So we are not talking about a 5-star architecture, extremely expensive, with a very fashion and very top-end decoration and so on. We are talking about architecture for people who really need a basic house. But in this case, we are much over the basic needs, because the quality of the space is also very nice. So, if you don't like those kind of building and you consider low level or a sort of degradation, well, it is not. Some building made by This approach, with the social participation approach, that they are definitely low level, and we can quote several cases in the south of Italy, for example. Many projects are failure because the project was compromised by several variables, which was not under the control of the architect and the government. But in this specific case, the quality of the architecture is very high, and especially, and this is what is most important in this kind of building, the architecture was tailored, was created according with the needs of the people. Giancarlo De Carlo spent hours and hours and hours in the discussion with the future inhabitant and try to listen what is their needs, their life. And here we come back again on the issue of the social participation and especially the structuralist, because the architect somehow have to interpret, must give an interpretation of the social structures of the people who is going to live here in order to get much more information. The people have to express what is their life, what is their social structures, how they live. And the architect have to respect those form of social complexity, and at the same time very softly try to solve some problems that definitely are in the original lifestyle. Yes, because we have to say that sometimes, even you and me, we live in a certain condition which are not perfect. It is our habit, it is what we like, it is what we know. But some mistakes are or weakness in the living condition are always there. So the architect have to convince the people to change some habit and definitely respect what is their form of style. This kind of building can be considered structuralist because the architect have to understand the structures of the family, the structures of that specific society. Another architect that we have to quote, and here we are really in front of one giant of the architecture of the 20th century, it is the Japanese Kenzo Tang. He was one of the most talented architects in all the century. Again, today his work can be considered controversial, but it is very easy to criticize one architect after 50 years of his work. Definitely, his work was simply connected with the spirit of his time. In this case, we are also in front of brutalist and structuralist architecture. Some of his projects are again macro structures, which it means they are a sort of very deep investigation in terms of single unit, and then this single unit can be repeated endless. Basically, all the world can be covered by this kind of structures because it includes at the same time modularity. It is very simple to build, and in theory also very cheap, and can be linked together with a very powerful system of aggregation. So in this case, the city, it is not anymore composed by different style, different language, different typology, block, super block, nothing at all. The city itself become one building. Building and city become together. There are super building. This is, for example, this picture could be familiar for the people who love the dystopia cartoon or movie, something like Blade Runner or some Japanese cartoon and so on. Because in fact, all those kind of super city, ugly form, ugly environment, super high-tech places and world, they are definitely come from Kenzo Tang elaboration. They are macro structures. We like, we don't like, that is not very important. But what it is very important is this process of composition. It is a part of the history of the human thinking. It's a part of the history of architecture of 20th century. And it's a fundamental project. His building was quite impressive in terms of composition. This is the Olivetti Center warehouse in Yokohama, the famous Italian typewriter and calculator factory. We have seen a project made by Ficini Pollini in the previous class. The quality of the composition is really impressive, it's very nice in terms of brutalist architecture, and also other buildings made by Kenzo Tang are definitely masterpiece of architecture. It is very impressive, very, very powerful. It is a great work of brutalist architecture. But also in this brutalist architecture, in the previous work we have seen, what appears very clearly is the logic of the composition. Somehow it appears that there is a sort of very rigid and very solid program inside the design. It is not capricious. Somehow appear a form of program, logic behind, which is hidden in the design. The design, it is only the surface of the project, but inside there is a much more complicated program. It is very well documented. Unfortunately, we cannot describe in detail. The most impressive and probably the most famous project of Kenzo Tang, it is the New Tokyo, which, according with his opinion, have to be created in the Tokyo Bay. Now, we all know that Tokyo is a huge city. Nowadays, it reaches 25 million of people. But in the past, there is the same problem, overpopulation. So Kenzo Tang came out with an idea of immense superstructures which have to occupy the Tokyo Bay. So it is a floating city. Now, the floating city, it is not a new concept in Asia, for example, in Thailand, but also in Japan. And this city was based on very solid infrastructures, road, railway, public transportation, which across all the Tokyo Bay. And then different branch with residential and office building. In theory, this kind of composition could occupy the whole area of Tokyo Bay. Fortunately, I have to say it was not built, because otherwise the beautiful Tokyo Bay was completely destroyed. But in terms of interest in the history of architecture, that is a very important and impressive project. Again, this project of such kind of complexity it can be built only with a very rigid, very solid, and very strict logic program, which intend to create a superstructures, a city, created by zero. That is one of the most important and impressive contributions of Kenzo Tang in the structuralist architecture. Now we have to touch a completely different topic, which is the postmodernist architecture. Compared with the structuralist architecture, the two trends cannot be more different. We can consider the structuralist architecture like a late expression of the modernism, probably one of the very last last consequences of the modernist architecture. The process was quite logic, quite severe, quite ethic, was based on a very strict discipline in terms of development of project and strong will to the society and so on. The postmodernist is quite different. And as we mentioned in the previous discussion, everything was based on the logic of the fragments, the logic of the dissolution of every strong philosophy. Why we put these two different movements, different trends together, structuralism and the postmodernist? Well, it's quite important to notice basically the opposite intention of the two trends. If the structuralism and the modernism in general was based on a very solid discipline, very strict method of work, the postmodernist is basically the contrary. They intend to be more playful. They play with the element of architecture. The methodology is no more based on the rigor of the modernism, the rationalism, the purist form, but was exactly the contrary. People, architects, play with forms. Structuralism still intend to create a universal method to create every form of possible architecture, but In the case of the postmodernist architecture, which is we can consider post-structuralist architecture, and very closely to the deconstruction architecture, the key point is interpretation of the past. Structuralist architecture still intend to create a universal method, very solid, the vision of the universe somehow. But in the case of the postmodernist, what appear is the completely collapse of every form of universal truth. What appear then, it is a sort of discussion on previous discussion, or better, in terms of Derrida, interpretation of interpretation. The structuralist architecture still intend to generate a method so powerful which is basically useful for everything. On the contrary, the postmodernist architecture assume the fact that everything is already done, everything is already written, everything is already discussed, nothing new under the sun, like in the Bible. For this reason, there is no need to invent anything, because all the elements which can be used in architecture are already there. This is why many architects which belongs or are categorized under the postmodernist architecture are extremely controversial, we can say, because they intend to create a project which is very ambiguous. There is no any form of universal truth. The architecture it is in between modern but using the classic element of architecture, but it is not a kind of neoclassicism. On the contrary of the neoclassicism, all the historical elements which is used in the postmodernist are only quotation. So, in short, the logic of the postmodernist architecture, it is a quotation of something else. Simply quotation? No, that is not so simple. Quotation, but extract the detail from the original context and replace this element in a completely different context. Thanks of this action of the replacement of the details from the original context to a new context, the element assume a new meaning. For example, in any a very important project quoted in every book, it is the villa that Robert Venturi made for his mother, Vanna Venturi. It is called Vanna Venturi House. This building, it is not very attractive nowadays. It is quite conventional. We can find several villas like this nowadays, but in fact this villa was very influential. We can find some element, for example, which is typical of the classic architecture. The big triangle on the top, which designed the main facade of the villa, it looks like a Greek temple. Then we have an arch, which is just a decoration. We have the window on the left side, which is a typical modernist window. We have the strip window of Le Corbusier. In short, we have all the elements, which is the classic element in the modernist and classic architecture, but out of context. And thanks of this elaboration, all the single element has new meaning, has new value. This is very important in all the postmodernist architecture. Now, there are a lot of projects of Robert Venturi which is quite interesting. For example, the Sainsbury Wing National Gallery, made in 1991, it looks like a relics of the ancient building. It looks like a piece of classic building which can be a kind of fragment from the past, a ruin which is preserved by the destruction. But actually, this is a completely new building. The classic order are used in an anomalous way. The open of the entrance, it is quite brutal. There is no decoration. The windows, which is very typical in the, for example, in the Italian context, which is a blind window. In Italy, In the classic architecture, this is a kind of overlap of the history. In the past, someone created the window and after it was no use anymore, so it was closed. But in this case, it is intentionally closed. It was designed to be a thick window. It is a quotation of the classic architecture. Also, the overlapping of the columns, the different form of order of the columns, the strange composition of the facade. It looks like a classic architecture, but classic it is not. Postmodernist architecture now become very successful. It was easy food somehow. Everyone would like this kind of architecture because it's easy, it's funny, it's playful, it's quite joyful if we want. And especially it is easy to digest because it recalls the element of architecture, historical architecture that everyone knows. So somehow it is much more acceptable for the common people. In the Memorial Hall of Harvard University, made in 1995, well, this one, it looks really like a Tudor castle in England or some cathedral in Europe or over-decorated the East Europe architecture of some special function, we don't know. But what it is interesting is it looks like classic architecture, it looks like traditional European architecture, but classic is not. It is a completely different function, made a few years ago, and in fact you will never find the same element of this building in any possible architecture from the past. It is a sort of reinvention of the memory. Now, there are a lot of architecture, for example, in US, New York, for example, which recall the Gothic church, the Gothic cathedral. But this one, it is a pure neoclassic architecture. It means they really copy all the elements from the classic architecture, Gothic or Renaissance, in an appropriate way. The postmodernists don't do that. The postmodernists take details and put out of context those elements, giving new form of meaning. Very typical of this approach is the work of Michael Graves. I want to quote a very funny building, which is the Portland building. This building, it is basically a cube, so it is the basic form of architecture. We have all the classic elements, something like paraste and capital. The windows are the prototype of the window, just a square. And in the original model, there are very interesting decoration. On the top of the building, there is a sort of quotation of the Acropolis of Athens. Somehow, this building is simply a joke, a very cultivated joke. It is not just a simple, a very trivial play on some simple architecture result. It is a very sophisticated system of multiple quotation. The final result, it is a kind of toy. But this is exactly what it is the intention of the architect, play with the form. A very remarkable case of postmodernist architecture. It is, of course, one of the most talented author in this section. It is Philip Johnson, one of the most intelligent and smart guy in the architecture of 20th century. Very famous building is the AT&T buildings skyscraper, which is a typical modernist skyscraper, high-rise building, but on the top there is some form of decoration which recall somehow the Greek temple. It is a very good looking, it is a very interesting design, it is a quotation of something else. But in fact, the work of Philip Johnson, it is always of quotation of something else. And this one is very clear since the glass house made for himself in New Canaan. The glass house is a modernist architecture, which recalled the design of Mies van der Rohe, of course. And in this case, it is even more close the work of Mies van der Rohe than Mies van der Rohe itself. So in this case, we are not in front of a building which is in the trend, in the direction of Mies van der Rohe. it is a work which quote Mies van der Rohe since the very beginning. Somehow Philip Johnson intended to quote something else in all his impressive career. In Pittsburgh, high-rise building in Pennsylvania made in 2007, it is definitely an office building, but it looks like a cathedral or a Gothic architecture, but all made by glass. So it is at the same time definitely a contemporary work, but with some recall of the traditional ancient building from Europe. Last work that we have to quote is, of course, Piazza Italia made by Moore, and this is a collection of pieces of classic architecture, but combined in a very chaotic way. Everything is quite precise somehow, but the collection of work make this square extremely joyful. Like or don't like, that is not the point. The point it is a work of quotation, work made by fragment. The people, generally speaking, the audience like, because it's a very successful square. In terms of critics of architecture, this is much more controversial. Many people adore this building, many people hate it. But what it is quite important is we cannot avoid to consider this work as a fundamental work in the trend of 20th century. The architecture is no more original, but it is a quotation of something else. This is probably the most important, the essence of the postmodernist architecture.